Good afternoon on what is a cold and chilly day. It is Thursday, the 25th of November. I'm back in the reading nook with a cat who is not mine on my lap and a nice hot cup of tea, which I really need. Well, today I have a big pile of parcels which I want to try and tackle, but first I am going to look at something interesting, which is 40 years old this year, and that is Call of Cthulhu, fantasy role-playing in the worlds of H.P. Lovecraft by Sandy Peterson and published by the Chaosium. Now this is its 40th anniversary, which was just a couple of weeks or so ago, and this is basically my copy of the first edition, which is somewhat damaged. This was one reason why I picked it up at a reasonable price. If only I could have had enough to buy a mint copy. But what I wanted to look at is what's inside this box and what's slightly different from what you may be familiar to you from later copies of Call of Cthulhu. Certainly up until 5th edition, and then to a certain extent 6th edition. Definitely not 7th edition, because essentially that's a radical new shift in design and look at the book, and makes great use of colour, and has gone basically a mechanical overhaul. And it's a much bigger book in the or pair of books, I should say, one for the Investigator and one for the Keeper. So, got the back, an image that will be familiar to many long-time fans of the game. And what's in the back? Eldritch Horrors. Its rugose, dead-eyed rudiment of a head swayed drunkenly from side to side. Its forepaws were extended with talons spread wide, and its whole body was taut with murderous malignity. That's a quote from H.P. Lovecraft. And then enter the awesome universe of the Cthulhu Mythos. Awesome universes. Those dread tales in which magic, science, arcane lore, and dark destinies irrevocably sear the lives of those for whom the bizarre and the curious have unseemly attraction. Specially designed to portray the situations and denizens of the Mythos, Call of Cthulhu uses a variant of the BRP system, basic roleplay, adding characteristics for sanity and education. Both new additions there. The first book is basic roleplaying itself. For the second, by the largest, book is Call of Cthulhu, which explains the characteristics, skills, occupations, and resources available to investigators, the many beings specific to the Mythos: deep ones, flying polyps, dimensional shamblers, shantax, Chthonians, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, etc. 4 rules for magic and the use of the famous books: the Necronomicon, the Devermius Mysterious, Unspreckled Jalican Colton. I apologise for my poor pronunciation there, which have fascinated readers for decades. This book translates the Mythos fiction into FRP terms. Scenarios are drawn in the style of Lovecraft, not directly from specific tales. The third book is a source book for the 1920s, consisting of 9 Mythos data, price lists, plans, maps, distances, thumbnail biographies, as well as garden variety monsters upon which budding investigators can sharpen their skills. There are character and monster silhouettes for play, record sheets, a world map of dig sites, and 6 dice, 1d4, 3d6, 1d8 and 1d20. Now, no 10-sided dice because they weren't available at the time, and when it came to rolling percentiles, you rolled a d20, which was marked 0 to 9, and you rolled that twice. So what's inside? What have we got? Now, this copy doesn't have that copy of basic roleplay, but it's not a budget problem, okay, because basic roleplay really didn't change very much over its history in the copies certainly that I've seen. But what we've got is the rulebook, and you compare that to the rulebook for today, which is 4 times as thick and spread across 2 hardbacks. You can play using the Keeper's rulebook, of course. The Investigator's handbook adds a lot of detail. And you get inside, we've got the traditional photograph of H.P. Lovecraft himself, which graced the insides of many a Call of Cthulhu rulebook over the years. Map of basically New England with Boston there, and then further up we have, let's have a look, shall I see, there's Kingsport, shall I see where Oh, and then Arkham as well nearby. There we go. I'm supposed to the right name. Yeah, basically, then Arkham and so on. Sorry, I'm looking at this going, the dark colour. It shouldn't be the sea, but it is. So yeah, basically, sketch map of certain New England territories. We get into the introduction, and which explains, what the game covers and purpose of the game, and playing aids and notice of keepers, and with a list of the fiction that she should read in preparation. And then we've got a piece of artwork showing something strange going on at the cemetery. And long-time fans of Call of Cthulhu will recognise that from appearing later in the book. And that's a feature that you'll see. A lot of the artwork appeared first in this edition, but would actually be moved around a bit in basically different pages and different locations. And then we have adapting the basic role-playing character to Call of Cthulhu. So literally, basically, you start the process here. You start off with the basic role-play system, and then you move on to Call of Cthulhu. You don't go straight to Call of Cthulhu, which is a little bit odd, I think, by our sensibilities. We wouldn't think of doing that. Let's go straight to Call of Cthulhu. But anyway, and then we have creation of the Investigator, and so there's no real guide here to rolling essentially strength and dexterity and intelligence, that sort of thing. That's all covered in the basic roleplay introductory book. But creating the Investigator, we add the all-important stats of education, representing his base knowledge into academically that way, and will generate the points the player would then spend on the investigator's occupation, and of course Sanity as the other one, because that represents essentially his mental fortitude, his ability to withstand the revelations of the true nature of the universe. And the other thing that's interesting here, and I'll show you why, is we have skill categories. Now, when we think of Call of Cthulhu, it doesn't categorise the skills, it just gives you the list of skills. But if you look on a character sheet, I'll just dig one out, here we go, which looks not unlike the Call of Cthulhu sheet you will recognise of old, but it categorises the skills. So you have knowledge skills, and perception skills, manipulation skills, and what else we got? Agility skills down there. It categorises them by type. It really doesn't need to, but it does, and I think that's a hangover essentially from sort of iteration of early iteration of basic roleplay, and RuneQuest, where you would, that's standard, and even today RuneQuest does this, and then leaping into these essentially over the page, and we open with a character, an example of investigation creation, introducing Harvey Walters. Throughout these rules, the story of Harvey Walters, the New York mystic, will be an example of play. Let's roll up Harvey and see his scores using 3d6. Here we go. And here's the list down here. That's a lot more open. That's basically it's not done sort of like a little compact paragraph or two. That's actually quite open, and it's in its organisation. When we come to the example of his working for a living and choosing an occupation, that's a bit more compact. That's how we would recognise it from Stanford's basically standard play. And we've got a list of the occupations here that we will know and recognise. Journalist, parapsychologist, professor, historian, antiquarian, author, other, dilettante, universal. The universal we don't recognise. Essentially, it's basically covering everything else that the ones here don't. And then we've got a write-up of Harvey himself, which again will be familiar before we go into very quickly into the skills. And again, we've got that categorization of the skills. So you have attack skills and parry skills. So you have fencing attack and fencing parry, and knife attack and knifing parry and nightstick parry. It differentiated between those, and again, that's kind of a hangover from basic role playing and RuneQuest. That would be streamlined in future issues, future editions of the role playing game, right down to 7th edition, which essentially could streamline that down to sort of like fighting. and then you can specialise after a while. But it's that simple. So yeah, there we go. You know, it's the perception skills, manipulation, stealth. And again, in some ways that makes them easier to find what's in that category, but you know, that soon went. We have a list of all the firearms and melee weapons. Again, fairly simple. Never particularly complex when it comes to Call of Cthulhu. You know, so you know, you have a handgun, or a 22 automatic and a 22 revolver, you know, and so on, and it lists them like that. So the full list of all of the skills. Then we have a table here. We have 5 classes of monsters: minor, major, great old ones, outer gods, and moderates. So in the minor we have Byakhee, deep ones, fire vampires, Migo, night gaunts. In the major we have adult Chthonians, Hand of Tindalos, Spawn of Cthulhu, moderate immature Chthonian, dimensional shambler, formless spawn of Tsalkiwa. You know, that's kind of odd that we would think of it like that. You know, quite so much. But again, you know, here we have the first edition of the rulebook, which is really kind of setting it out, sort of like, okay, here's an example of the rules. Here, this is all playable. But again, it's future. In the future, the rulebook would future rulebooks would streamline a lot of this, would simplify a lot of this. Then we go into Sanity with a piece of artwork, which again we'll recognise from previous editions. And yeah, unfortunately, as I say, this isn't mint by any means. We have amendments made by a previous owner. We have a table of insanity and the typical options like catatonia, amnesia, agoraphobia, essentially ballistophobia, fear of bullets. Great one for when when you're relying upon that gun as your crutch. At that point, you're going, I've got a gun, it will keep me safe. No, it won't. I'm really scared of bullets. Then we have availability of psychoanalysis and how to cure insanity. Again, this is the kind of the first time where you have the idea of, you know, player characters going insane from seeing something they shouldn't. And then we delve into the Mythos, and we have again great further categorization and discussion of what's the differences. Essentially, we have a summary of the Mythos, the alien races, the deities, the races, and the monsters. So we have outer gods is Azaroth, the Demon Sultan, great old ones Cthulhu, Hasta, and the races and monsters listed below. Just show you that. Okay, and these are all unillustrated here. So normally we would expect to see something here, basically there. That space is empty though. Where's the illustration of the Cthulhu himself? Previous editions future editions put something in there, just a little a drawing of some kind that would illustrate the entity of the Mythos, whatever it was. And we have the classification also of, Cthulhu is a great old one, deep ones are a lesser servitor race, dark young of Shub-Niggurath, greater servitor race, dimensional shamblers, lesser independent race, and so on. Again, a lot in terms of really the classifications that we don't no longer kind of use or never really quite did. It was useful sort of like for trying to get some idea of where these particular entities and races and monsters sat in terms of the Mythos hierarchy. But yeah, how much use that was, I don't know. And then we go on to Magic and Spell, prefaced by, again, another piece of artwork which has graced many of the pages of the Call of Cthulhu rulebook. And this is dealing with the books. We have a full list of the books there. And this is quite fascinating because essentially you remember looking at all these pages of the books going, I want to know more about that book. What's in that book? What does it say? And in a lot of cases we never did quite find out. We've got nice examples of play in here, which I really like. For example, so Harvey Walters being used as the example throughout. gets a copy of the Golden Goblin edition of Nameless Cults, and that explores the dangers of reading. And this time it's a second edition copy of the book, The Consequences. And then we come on to the Grimoire, the spells by different categories of beings. So again, the spells are kind of tied into that categorization of the Mythos into lesser independent race, servitor races, great old ones, and so on. Other gods, etc., elder gods, other gods, independent races, great old ones, etc., or servitor race. So there we go. And the spells are categorized by type. For the most part, what you're doing in here is the spells take the form of call, bind, or contact. So it's not, I cast a spell and I blast him with some with my arcane power. Now there are elements of spells in there like shriveling, but again, most player characters or investigators don't know those spells. But you've got things in here like Call Azathoth or Call Shub-Niggurath, Contact Yagolonak or Contact Cthulhu, and so on. And we've got other things like other spells do exist, so Bruise Space Mead or Resurrection, Dread Curse of Azathoth. But again, they are generally out of the realms of the player characters. There are more those belonging to the knowledge of the cultists, and they can be found in the books. And again, they take time to study. So that's what we've got in here. We have a list of, we've got a complete listing of all the spells there. And we've got a few magical items like the Glass from Leng and the Plutonian Drug. But where it gets kind of interesting in here is the essay on how to play the game. This is a really great guide on how to play Call of Cthulhu, presented in the first issue. The point here is that this game is different how you play it. It's not a game where you have a lot of power. It's not a game where you ever really gain power. It's a game about learning secrets and trying to prevent others from learning them, and putting a stop to the machinations of those who would gain power by learning dark secrets. And suffering the consequences of doing that, despite the fact that ultimately what you're doing is heroic. Great. I have my neighbours shouting each other. So yeah, a guide to how to run the campaign, basically discussing how this is different to any other campaign you might have played, whether that's RuneQuest or Dungeons and Dragons. Both games with a certain degree of power creep of players getting better at skills and spells and magical items. Doesn't happen in this game. Doesn't happen. But then we get into ready to play scenarios. So we have the famous Bradford House, otherwise known as the Haunting. The Haunted. Basically, this is the Haunted House, the scenario known as the Haunted House, but it was subsequently changed to the Haunting. You will find this scenario in the quick start. Go check it out. It's an absolute classic. It's really good. It shows you how to do a haunted house scenario for Call of Cthulhu, and it's really creepy. Great, nice little maps there, nice and clear. And this isn't very long. It really covers. It's basically 1, 2, 3 pages long. Then we have the Madman. Basically about an encounter in the backwoods of Vermont, and that's still encountering with the basically it's a setup for a kind of a campaign against encountering with the Migo in the Green Mountain State. Then we have a similar kind of haunted house kind of scenario with the Bradford House, where the player characters are investigators are asked to investigate a house, check it out, and discover basically it's below a set of deep pond caverns, and the deep ones keep coming back again and again. Again, neither the Madman nor the Bradford House, basically showing the Bradford House, have been reprinted. They've only appeared in these early editions of the rulebook. There's the caverns beneath the house. So where have we got to? Then we've got a map of Arkham, which again was published numerous times. Then we go into Notes on a Fragment of the Necronomicon by Phileas P. Sadowski. which is a really nice piece of colour fiction, which adds basically, the ideas, explores the ideas of behind the mythos and his exposure to it as a scholar. We have rewards, basically, which comes essentially, rewards for valour. I think that gets something that didn't appear in later editions either, because essentially the rewards themselves to players was knowledge that they helped save humanity. And then we have a section on cultists. Now this would later go into this book, source book for the 1920s. So yeah, there we go. Libraries and their use. Basically a guide to libraries around the world. We have sages, and for the game, essentially studying with a sage who might give you some knowledge that you need, including the knowledge of the Cthulhu mythos, so you literally have to go out to the wilderness. A beginning scenario for a campaign. Again, this is a strange encounter out on basically a bus journey near Montpellier in Vermont, and again that can start a campaign. We've got a timeline for H.P. Lovecraft himself, and then we've got something really different, which again hasn't been printed anywhere else. Shadows over Hollywood, a more complete scenario. Again, only appeared in the first edition of the rule book, and basically got involves essentially adventure occurs in the greater Los Angeles area. And involves occult activity, of which there was a lot during the 1920s, it says. Then we have Cultist Layer. Again, this appeared in later editions of the rulebook as well, and it's sort of like an interlude or a final location, part of the campaign for confronting the cultists and their attempt at a summoning in essentially the extinct caldera of a volcano. When we have list of nautical skills in later editions, this would be transferred over to the another thing that would be the source book for the 1920s. And then we have errata editions, effective 1982. So this is a later printing of it. I would say it's not the absolute first. It's a later, basically, because it corrects a few things. And then what have we got? So that's basically. So this is essentially one of the printings of the first edition. And then we go into a source book from the 1920s. Useful from the start because you've got the deck plans for an airship. Classic piece of classic item of travel, essentially classic means of travel for the 1920s if you could afford it. Then we go and we've got a timeline for the 1920s for the who aren't aware of your history. Let's see what else we've got in here. The year 1920, just put in the bottom. We've got a long selection of biographies of famous people alive during the period, beginning with, let's have a look, who have we got? Okay, Emilio Aguinaldo, local Spanish-Filipino revolutionary, and then Kemal Ataturk, Irving Berlin, Annie Besant, and then we've got basically all the way down to Emiliano Zapata, George Herbert Wells, and Francisco Villa. And then we've got companies of the period, so essentially you can use those. Essentially, okay, what products were available? That's always useful. For adding colour more than anything else. Had crimes and covering arrests, so essentially the player characters are fairly likely to get themselves arrested. Some history is actually a discussion of the Volstead Act and then Prohibition, which again Call of Cthulhu would come back to in basically with a couple of lengthy essays, whether or not it's in the Keeper's Keeper's Compendium books or magazine articles. How to handle bribery. Sorry, my fingers are getting cold. So what's we got? Alternative means of handling previous experience. Now this is interesting in that it does it term by term, rather than giving you a bulk point of points. You basically go, okay, I'm going to be an author for 4 years. Well, here's the points you get for that. Oh, then I'm going to be a minor, and you get the points for that. And then we have the first of the various locations. Then we've got example character. The other alternative example example player character investigator is Eben Stone, created using this turn-by-turn method. We've got essentially maps of If in Nigeria and Skara Brae in Orkney Isles, basically the various locations covered in here. Again, railway coaches, basically floor plans for railway coaches, because essentially you can have enough horror on a railway. Prices and cash, just useful guides, just idea how much the player characters are going to be spending out if you're involving that, including that in your game. New weapons, basically from boomerang and musket to dynamite stick and 75mm field cannon. Arranged sort of like also by zones, so essentially wherever you are in the world, you've got a quick method of determining whether or not a weapon type is available. Notes on the weapons, black market weapons, more sites of import. And this is such a good little book because essentially there's so much information in here in a few pages. So Beasts and Monsters covers everything but from bat large and bear common black, dog ordinary, to ghosts, vampires, zombies and so on. Even there's a giant squids in there, and pixie, should you want to include them in your game. And finally got a bibliography of history and so on, with more maps of locations there. So there's quite a lot there you get. In addition, let's just see what else we've got in here. Now, understandably, I don't have the BRP book. I don't miss that particularly. But I do have. I don't think I've got the. I've got the map, the world map, which I'm holding upside down. Of course I am. So let's just put that back up there like that. There we go, there's the world map. If I go lastly, I'm going to just see what I've got here. And of course you've got the character figures. Okay, so these are the only illustrations of the Mythos creatures in this volume. So obviously Byakhee, Chthonian, Dark Young of Shivnarath. And it's what's interesting, if you have a look at these silhouettes of the investigators, so many of these poses would actually influence the look of look at the miniatures that Grenadier and Ratham would later manufacture. Anyway, so that's what's in my copy of the Call of Cthulhu rulebook, box set from 1980. Again, not first edition, but a basically an updated reprint from 1981. An interesting item, I think. Like I said, what's great about this is that a lot of this content in here is still very playable. The scenarios are still very playable, and you could take those scenarios and play them using the current content, or you could take those scenarios and basically more or less play those with a bit of adaptation. Fairly easy. But it started here because this is such an influential role-playing game. Introduced Sanity. Without the rules for Insanity, we'd have a totally different idea of how we handle fear in role-playing games, I suspect. Introduced the horror genre. There were no real horror games before it, but at the same time it introduced the Lovecraft mythos and quantified it in terms of making it something that you could bring into play, and from there that's proliferated into innumerable role-playing games and board games of its own. I think, basically, but it started here. And then let's not forget just how many supplements and scenarios which have followed since the publication of this book, or this box set, right down to today, where there are still campaigns coming out. You know, there have got to be 20, 30 campaigns for Call of Cthulhu available, you know, that you can track down and buy. And very few role-playing games have that many. I mean, it's no surprise, but it's because it's 40 years old. But this is not a role-playing game which has lent itself necessarily to a lot of like supplements. There are a handful, it is true, you know, probably a couple of handfuls, but what I mean is essentially there are more scenarios and campaigns for this than there are necessary supplements. So this is really well supported with content that you can play in the long run. So I'm glad to be able to look at this as sort of like as a sort of historical role-playing artifact, even though it's not in particularly good condition. And I'm really glad to be able to basically bring it out to the Nook and freeze my fingers and show it to you on basically on what is essentially as close to Call of Cthulhu's 40th anniversary as I could get. So I opened up the starter set in the previous video and showed basically where you could start now in 2021, and this is what you would have started with in 1981. So yeah, and again, elements of this, although it will be the second edition essentially that will appear in the forthcoming anniversary box set from Chaosium, along with a lot of other early books which are now long out of print, and I will be reviewing that and basically reviewing certainly those books that I haven't reviewed in due course and doing an unboxing. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching another unboxing in the Nook. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, please click the like button down below, and if you've got any comments or feedback, please add those. I do take the time to read and respond as I can. And lastly, if you want to be alerted to yet more unboxings in the Nook, where you will see me with a box or game package which I will open up and talk about to the best extent of my knowledge for 10 minutes or so. All, of course, accompanied by a cat who is not mine most of the time, and a nice hot cup of tea. Do please hit that subscribe button. In the meantime, thanks again for watching, and I'll be back again soon with another unboxing the Nook. Bye for now.